Steam rose from the pot of simmering marinara sauce as Maria Hernandez stirred it with practiced precision, her weathered hands moving with the same gentle rhythm they had perfected over 32 years of motherhood. The familiar scent of garlic and basil filled David's suburban kitchen in Phoenix, Arizona, where the November evening had settled into a comfortable 75 degrees, far cry from the bitter Chicago winters she'd endured alone while raising him. Through the sliding glass doors, she could see her 4-year-old grandson, Tommy, chasing fireflies in the backyard, his delighted squeals mixing with the distant hum of evening traffic on Bell Road. These Sunday dinners had become sacred to her, the one constant in a life that had shifted dramatically since David's promotion to regional manager at his tech company had brought financial stability she'd never known. "Mom, the table's set," David called from the dining room, his voice carrying that subtle edge of impatience she'd been noticing more frequently lately. At 32, her son had inherited her dark eyes and stubborn jawline, but success had hardened his features in ways that sometimes made her feel like she was looking at a stranger. Sarah, David's wife of 6 years, emerged from the bathroom. Down the hall, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite chasing after Tommy all day. She worked as a dental hygienist and always carried herself with the polished confidence of someone who'd never known financial insecurity. "Something smells incredible, Maria," she said, though her smile seemed strained. "You really didn't have to go to all this trouble?" "It's no trouble," Maria replied, ladling the sauce over the fresh pasta she'd made from scratch that morning in her small apartment across town. "I enjoy cooking for my family." The word family hung in the air, with a weight that seemed to press against the kitchen's recessed lighting. David appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie-in on Sundays. He dressed like he was heading to a board meeting. "Actually, Mom, we need to talk about something," he said, his tone taking on that corporate formality she'd grown to dread. "Sarah and I have been discussing, well, some changes that need to happen." Maria's stirring slowed. After 3 decades of reading her son's moods, she could sense the shift in the atmosphere like an approaching storm. "What kind of changes?" "Let's sit down first," Sarah interjected, her voice artificially bright. "Tommy, come inside, sweetie. Dinner time." The dining room felt smaller than usual as they gathered around the oak table David had bought when he'd gotten his first big promotion. Maria had helped him pick it out at Ashley Furniture, proud that her son could finally afford something new instead of the second-hand pieces that had furnished their cramped Chicago apartment for so many years. Tommy climbed into his booster seat, his face flushed from running outside. "Abuela, did you make your special bread?" he asked, using the Spanish endearment she'd taught him despite David's occasional protests about confusing the child with too many languages. "Of course, mijo," she said, ruffling his dark hair. "Your favorite—" David cleared his throat as they began eating, the scrape of forks against plates creating an uncomfortable soundtrack to the tension building in the room. "Mom, you know we love having you here for dinner every week." The words carried an unspoken, but that made Maria's stomach clench. She'd heard that tone before when David was 12 and had to tell her he'd broken her favorite vase, when he was 16 and had crashed her car, when he was 25 and had to explain why he was moving to Arizona for work. "But we've been thinking," Sarah continued, taking over where David had hesitated, "that maybe it would be better if we made these dinners more occasional, like monthly instead of weekly." The pasta suddenly tasted like cardboard in Maria's mouth. She set down her fork carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, Mom, it's not about you doing anything wrong," David said quickly, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. "It's just that we're trying to establish our own family traditions, and having you here every week feels like, well, it's a lot of pressure." "Pressure." The word came out as barely a whisper. Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest but firm. "Maria, you have to understand our perspective. We have busy lives, and sometimes we just want to have quiet family time without having to entertain." "I don't need entertaining," Maria said, her voice growing stronger. "I come here to see my family, to spend time with my grandson, to help however I can." "That's exactly what we're talking about," David said, his frustration finally breaking. Through his corporate diplomacy, the helping mom, we don't need help anymore. We're not struggling college students or young parents scraping by. We can handle our own lives. The silence that followed was broken only by Tommy's innocent chatter as he played with his food, oblivious to the adult drama unfolding around him. Maria felt something cracking inside her chest, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. "So you're saying I'm not needed?" she said. "We're saying we need space," Sarah replied, her tone gentler now, but no less final. "We appreciate everything you've done, but we're at a different stage in our lives now." David nodded, seemingly relieved that his wife had found the words he couldn't exactly. "It's not personal, Mom. It's just how families evolve." Maria looked around the table. the grandson who was the light of her life, at the daughter-in-law who'd always treated her with polite distance, at the son she'd sacrificed everything to raise, the son who'd never known that she'd worked 3 jobs to pay for his college tuition, who'd never asked why she never dated or remarried after his father left, who'd never wondered how she'd managed to keep food on the table and clothes on his back through all those lean years. "I see," she said quietly. "So after 32 years of being your mother, I've become ... a burden." The word slipped out of David's mouth before he could stop it, hitting the dining room like a physical blow. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Tommy looked up from his plate, sensing the sudden change in energy, even if he didn't understand the words. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. The word echoed in her mind: burden. Burden. Burden, drowning out everything else. She'd been called many things in her life: strong, determined, stubborn, proud, but never a burden. Not by her own son David, Sarah hissed, but the damage was already done. "I didn't mean David started," but Maria was already standing, her napkin falling to the floor like a white flag of surrender. "No," she said, her voice steady, despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "You meant it, and maybe you're right." She walked to the kitchen in a daze, her muscle memory taking over as she began cleaning up the dishes she'd used to prepare their meal. The same hands that had changed David's diapers, packed his school lunches, worked double shifts to pay for his karate lessons and school supplies, now scraped leftover food into the garbage disposal. "Mom, come back," David called from the dining room. "Let's talk about this." But there was nothing left to talk about. The word had been spoken, the truth revealed. After decades of believing that her sacrifices had meaning, that her love had value, she'd learned otherwise from the person whose opinion mattered most. She dried her hands on the dish towel, gathered her purse and sweater, and walked toward the front door. Behind her, she could hear David and Sarah having a hushed, urgent conversation, their voices mixing with Tommy's confused questions about where Abuela was going. Her hand was on the doorknob when David appeared behind her. "Mom, don't leave like this. I'm sorry I said that word. I was frustrated, but I didn't mean it the way it sounded." Maria turned to face her son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The boy she'd raised was gone, replaced by a man who measured love in terms of convenience and family obligations as burdens to be managed. "Yes, you did," she said softly. "And that's okay. Maybe it's time I stopped being one." She opened the door and stepped into the warm Arizona evening, leaving behind the life she'd built around loving someone who no longer wanted to be loved by her. The door closed with a soft click that sounded to her ears like the end of everything she'd thought she knew about being a mother. Maria's apartment complex sat 15 miles across Phoenix from David's suburban neighborhood, a journey that normally took her 25 minutes but felt eternal that November night. The Desert Palms apartments weren't much to look at. Beige stucco buildings, arranged around a small pool that stayed empty most of the year, but she'd chosen the place specifically because it was close enough to see her family regularly without being intrusive. Now that proximity felt like a mock-up of her poor judgment. She parked her aging Honda Civic in Space 147 and sat in the darkness for several minutes, letting the engine tick as it cooled. Through her windshield, she could see Mrs. Patterson from 148, watching television, the blue glow flickering against her curtains. Normal life, continuing as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Her phone buzzed against her purse, David's name appearing on the screen. She declined the call and climbed the concrete stairs to her second-floor unit, her legs feeling heavier with each step. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning, neat, modest, and achingly quiet. 8,700 square feet that somehow felt both too small and impossibly empty. The living room held a second-hand couch she'd reupholstered herself, a small television on a stand she'd assembled with David's help when she'd first moved in, and dozens of framed photographs chronicling 32 years of single motherhood. There was 4-year-old David on his first day of kindergarten, gap-toothed and proud in his new sneakers. 10-year-old David at his first Little League game, Maria cheering from the bleachers in her work uniform because she'd had to leave her evening shift at the diner early. 16-year-old David at his high school graduation where he'd been valedictorian, thanks to the tutoring sessions Maria had paid for by working overtime at the hospital laundry. 25-year-old David at his college graduation, the first person in either side of their family to earn a degree. Every photograph told the story of sacrifice that had become as natural to Maria as breathing. The story her son had just dismissed. As a burden, her phone buzzed again. This time it was Sarah calling. Maria turned the phone face down and walked to her small kitchen, where she put on a pot of coffee out of habit more than desire. The routine of measuring grounds and adding water helped steady her hands, which had been shaking since she'd left David's house. She'd been 19 when she'd gotten pregnant with David, 20 when his father had decided that responsibility wasn't for him and disappeared into the Texas oil fields, 21 when she'd moved from San Antonio to Chicago for a job opportunity that turned out to be a series of dead-end positions that barely kept them afloat. She'd been young, scared, and alone, but she'd never not once considered David a burden, even when he'd kept her awake for months with colic as a baby, even when childhood asthma had meant countless emergency room visits she couldn't afford, even when teenage rebellion had led to phone calls from school about fights and failing grades, even when college expenses had meant she'd lived on ramen, noodles, and generic coffee for 4 years so he could have the education she'd never gotten. She'd called it love. He'd called it a burden. The coffee finished brewing as Maria's phone rang for the 3rd time. She ignored it and poured herself a cup, adding the powdered creamer she bought because real cream was an unnecessary expense. The liquid was bitter and too hot, but she drank it anyway, needing something to anchor her to the present moment. Outside her kitchen window, she could see the lights of Phoenix stretching toward the mountains, millions of people living their lives with problems and joys she'd never know. Somewhere out there were other mothers who'd given everything to raise their children, other sons who'd grown up to find their mothers inconvenient, but that knowledge didn't make the pain any less sharp. Maria walked to her bedroom and opened the small desk where she kept her important papers: birth certificates, insurance documents, the will she'd written when David had graduated college and she'd finally had something to leave behind. At the back of the bottom drawer was a wooden box that had belonged to her own mother, filled with letters and cards David had made for her over the years. Mother's Day cards crafted from construction paper and decorated with glitter. Birthday cards with crayon drawings of the two of them holding hands. A letter he'd written in 5th grade for a school assignment about heroes, where he'd chosen her and described how she worked so hard to take care of him. A graduation speech he'd given as valedictorian, where he'd thanked my mother, who taught me that love means never giving up. She closed the box and placed it back in the drawer. Those words belonged to a different David, a different life, a different version of herself who'd believed that unconditional love was always reciprocated. Her phone rang again. This time she answered without looking at the caller ID. Mom. David's voice was tight with worry. "Thank God you answered. Are you okay? You left so suddenly." "I'm fine," she said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "Good. Listen, I'm sorry about dinner. I said some things I shouldn't have said. We both did. Can we talk about this tomorrow? Maybe I can come over after work and we can figure this out." Figure this out. As if her feelings were a problem to be solved, a glitch in their family system that needed debugging. "There's nothing to figure out," Maria said. "You were honest about how you feel. I appreciate honesty." "Mom, that's not Ty. Don't think you're a burden. I was frustrated and I said something stupid. You know how much I love you." Did she? Once she'd been certain of David's love the way she was certain of gravity or the sunrise, now she wondered if what she'd mistaken for love had actually been duty, obligation, the social expectation that adult children maintain relationships with their parents. "I know you love me," she said, "but I also know you meant what you said tonight, and maybe it's time I stopped pretending otherwise." "What do you mean?" Maria looked around her small apartment, taking inventory of a life that had been entirely focused on one person who no longer wanted her focus. "I mean, maybe it's time I figured out who I am when I'm not being your mother." "You'll always be my mother, will I?" The question surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise him. "Or will I be the woman who used to be your mother back when you needed mothering?" "Mom, you're scaring me. Where is this coming from? From 32 years of putting someone else's needs before her own? From a lifetime of believing that sacrifice was the same thing as love? From the sudden, devastating realization that she'd built her entire identity around a relationship that the other person found burdensome?" "I need some time to think," she said. "Don't call me for a while." "How long is a while?" "I don't know." She hung up before he could respond and turned off her phone. Then she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had grown cold and a blank piece of paper, trying to find words for feelings she'd never allowed herself to have. The letter took her 3 hours to write. She went through half a dozen drafts, crossing out paragraphs that sounded too angry, too sad, too desperate. She wanted her words to be honest without being cruel, clear without being harsh. She wanted David to understand not just what he'd done to her, but what she'd done to herself in the name of loving him. When she finally finished, the letter was 4 pages long, written in the careful cursive she'd learned in Catholic school 50 years earlier. She read it twice, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote David's name on the front in the same handwriting that had labeled his school notebooks and signed his permission. Slips for field trips. Then she packed a suitcase with a week's worth of clothes. left the letter on David's front porch at 3 in the morning, and drove east toward New Mexico as the sun rose over the Sonoran Desert for the first time in 32 years. Maria Hernandez was going somewhere without telling her son where she was going or when she'd be back. The freedom felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. David found the letter at 6:30 Monday morning when he opened his front door to retrieve the newspaper. The envelope lay propped against the decorative pot Sarah had filled with artificial flowers, his name written in his mother's familiar handwriting across cream-colored paper that seemed to glow in the early morning light. He'd been expecting this. After Maria had refused to answer her phone all day Sunday, after he'd driven to her apartment complex and found her car gone, after he'd lain awake most of the night replaying their conversation at dinner, he'd known she would try to explain herself in writing. She'd always been better with written words than spoken ones, a trait she'd passed down to him along with her dark eyes and stubborn streak. What he hadn't expected was the weight of the envelope in his hands, thick enough to suggest multiple pages, substantial enough to make his stomach clench with dread. Sarah was in the shower and Tommy was still asleep, so David sat on his front steps in his pajamas and t-shirt, watching the Arizona sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold while he worked up the courage to read what his mother had written. The first page started simply enough. "My dear David, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not forever, but long enough for both of us to think about what happened at dinner and what it means for our relationship going forward. I want you to know that I'm not writing this letter to make you feel guilty or to punish you for being honest about your feelings. You called me a burden, and while those words hurt more than I can express, I think you were telling me a truth that's been building for a long time. I've spent the last 32 years trying to be the mother I thought you needed, but I failed. To notice when you stopped needing me at all." David's hands were shaking by the time he reached the second paragraph. He'd expected anger, accusations, the kind of emotional manipulation he'd always associated with family drama. Instead, his mother's words carried a sadness so profound it made his chest ache. "I need to tell you some things I've never told you before, not because I want your pity, but because I think you deserve to understand the choices I made and why I made them. When your father left us, I was 20 years old with a 6-month-old baby and no idea how to survive on my own. My parents had disowned me for getting pregnant without being married, and his family wanted nothing to do with us after he disappeared. I had a high school diploma, no work experience, and a baby who cried for hours every night because of his colic. I could have given you up for adoption. Several people suggested it, including a social worker who told me I was too young and too poor to raise a child properly. She showed me photographs of families who wanted babies. People with college degrees and stable incomes in 2-parent homes who could give you everything. I couldn't. I kept those photographs for weeks, David. I would look at them while you slept. And imagine you growing up in houses with yards and college funds and parents who could help you with homework I didn't understand. I came so close to making that call." David had to stop reading. The idea that he'd almost been given away, that his mother had seriously considered it, hit him like a physical blow. He'd never known, never even suspected. In his mind, his childhood had been difficult but stable, anchored by a mother. Assumption changed everything. But every time I picked up the phone to call the agency, not because I was noble or maternal or any of the things people say about mothers who sacrifice for their children, I moved to Chicago for a job that paid barely above minimum wage, and I learned how to be a mother by making mistakes and figuring out how to fix them. I worked at a diner during the day and cleaned office buildings at night while you stayed with Mrs. Rodriguez, who charged me half of what other babysitters wanted because she felt sorry for us. When you got older and started school, I worked 3 jobs so I could be home when you got off the bus. I cleaned houses before dawn, worked at the hospital, laundry during school hours, and waitressed at night. I slept for hours a night for most of your childhood, but I told myself it was worth it because you were getting good grades and playing sports and growing into the kind of person I dreamed you could become." The front door opened behind him, and Sarah stepped out in her robe, her hair still damp from the shower. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. Then she saw the letter in his hands and her expression changed. "Is that from your mom?" David nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in his throat. "What does it say?" "She's gone." This is her explaining why. Sarah sat down beside him on the step, close enough that he could smell her shampoo and feel the residual warmth from her shower. "Are you okay?" "I don't know." He turned to the 3rd page, his eyes scanning ahead to see how much more there was to read. "She's telling me things I never knew. About when I was little, about how hard things were. Maybe I should read it too." "Not yet." The response was automatic, protective. Whatever his mother had written was meant for him, and he needed to understand it before he could share it with anyone else, even his wife. I want you to know that I never resented those sacrifices, David. Every job I worked, every hour of sleep. I lost every luxury I went without, so you could have what you needed. It was all worth it because I was building something. I was building you into the man I hoped you could become, and you became that man. You're educated and successful and principled and kind. You're a good husband and a wonderful father, and watching you with Tommy brings me more joy than you'll ever know. Everything I gave up, every opportunity I passed by, every relationship I didn't pursue because I was too busy being your mother. It was all worth it because you turned out to be exactly the person I dreamed you could be. But here's what I never realized until you called me a burden. I was so focused on building you that I forgot to build myself. I'm 52 years old. I've never traveled anywhere I wanted to go. I've never had a career that challenged me or excited me. I've never had a serious romantic relationship because I told myself you needed all of my attention. I've never lived anywhere because I chose to, never decorated a home to reflect my own taste. Never made friends who shared my interests because all of my interests centered around you. That's not your fault. Those were my choices and I made them freely. But they were also mistakes, and I'm only realizing that now. David looked up from the letter, his vision blurred by tears. He hadn't realized we're falling. Across the street, his neighbor Mr. Chen was loading his golf clubs into his truck, preparing for his Monday morning routine at the country club. Normal life, continuing while David's world shifted beneath him. David, Sarah's voice was gentle, worried. What did she say? She gave up everything for me, he whispered. Everything. And I called her a burden. He forced himself to keep reading, though each paragraph felt like another stone added to the weight building in his chest. Last night, when you said I was a burden, you revealed a truth that I think we both needed to face. You've outgrown your need for a mother, and I've never learned how to be anything else. We've been holding on to a relationship that no longer serves either of us, and it's making us both resentful. You resent me for still trying to mother you? When you're a grown man with your own family, I resent you for not appreciating sacrifices you never asked me to make. Neither of those feelings is fair or healthy, and they're poisoning something that used to be beautiful, so I'm leaving for a while. Not forever, but long enough to figure out who Maria Hernandez is when she's not David's mother. I'm going to travel to places I've always wanted to see. I'm going to try things I've always been too busy to try. I'm going to learn what it feels like to make decisions based on what I want instead of what someone else needs. I hope that when I come back, we can build a new kind of relationship. Not mother and child, but two adults who choose to love each other without obligation or burden. I hope we can be friends, David. Real friends. Who enjoy each other's company without the weight of all that history and sacrifice and guilt. But first, I need to learn how to be a person worth being friends with. I love you more than you'll ever know. But I'm done loving you more than I love myself. Your mother. Mariaps. Kiss Tommy for me and tell him his abuela will see him soon. This isn't goodbye forever, mijo. It's just goodbye for now. David set the letter down and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. 32 years of assumptions crumbled around him, leaving him to face the devastating reality of what his mother's love had cost her and what his thoughtless words had cost both of them. David, talk to me. Sarah's hand was on his back, rubbing slow circles the way she did when Tommy had nightmares. What can I do? I destroyed her, he said through his tears. My whole life, she was destroying herself to build me up, and I never even noticed. And then when she finally needed something from me just to feel wanted, to feel like she mattered, I called her a burden? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, reading over his shoulder as he held the letter between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears of her own. Oh, David, oh, honey, what have we done? 3 weeks after Maria had driven east into the New Mexico sunrise, David found himself standing in the lobby of the St. Francis Hotel in Santa Fe, clutching a piece of paper with her room number written in his own handwriting. The private investigator he'd hired had tracked her down through credit card receipts and hotel records, a process that had taken 2 weeks and cost him more money than he'd ever spent on anything for his mother. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd paid a stranger $800 to find the woman he'd claimed was too burdensome to see once a week. The hotel was exactly the kind of place Maria would choose, historic but affordable. Elegant but not pretentious. Through the large windows in the lobby he could see the plaza where Native American artisans sold jewelry and pottery. Tourists wandered between galleries and life moved at the unhurried pace of a city that had existed for 400 years. Can I help you? The desk clerk was a young woman with kind eyes and silver jewelry that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. I'm looking for Maria Hernandez. She's staying in room 237. Are you family? I'm her son. The words felt strange. in his mouth waited with new meaning after 3 weeks of reflection and regret. The clerk studied his face, perhaps seeing something in his expression that convinced her to bend the rules. She's not in her room right now. I saw her leave about an hour ago with her easel and paints. She's been going to the same spot every afternoon, the bench by the cathedral. You might find her there. David thanked her and walked the 3 blocks to the plaza, his heart pounding with each step. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say during the 5-hour drive from Phoenix, but now that he was close to seeing his mother again, all of his carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. He found her exactly where the desk clerk had suggested, sitting on a weathered wooden bench in the shadow of the Cathedral Basilica of St. Francis of Assisi. She was wearing a flowing skirt in shades of turquoise and cream that he'd never seen before. Her salt and pepper hair, pulled back with a colorful scarf instead of the practical ponytail she'd worn for as long as he could remember. In front of her, an easel held a half-finished watercolor painting of the cathedral's twin spires against the brilliant blue New Mexico sky. For a moment, David didn't recognize the woman on the bench as his mother. This person looked relaxed, content, younger somehow, despite the 3 weeks that had passed. She held her paintbrush with the same careful attention she'd once given to everything she did for him. But now that attention was focused entirely on her own creation. Mom? Maria looked up from her painting, and David saw a flash of emotions cross her face. Joy, wariness, and something else he couldn't quite identify. She set down her brush and studied him as if he were a stranger she was trying to place. David, how did you find me? I hired someone. He gestured toward the empty space on the bench beside her. Can I sit? She nodded, moving her paint supplies to make room. Up close, he could see that she looked different in ways that went beyond new clothes and a changed hairstyle. Her face was tanned from spending time outdoors, and there was a calmness in her expression that he'd never noticed before because he'd never looked closely enough. You look good, he said, and meant it. I feel good. She turned back to her painting, adding a delicate wash of pink to one of the cathedral spires. This is the first time in 32 years that I've done something just because I wanted to do it. It's liberating. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching tourists pose for photographs and pigeons pecking at crumbs near the fountain. The afternoon sun was warm but not oppressive, and David understood why his mother had chosen this place to figure out who she was beyond being his mother. I read your letter, he said finally. I assumed you would. That's why I wrote it. I had no idea about any of it. The jobs, the sacrifices, how close you came to giving me up for adoption. Why didn't you ever tell me? Maria paused in her painting, her brush hovering over the palette as she considered his question. Because telling you would have defeated the purpose. I didn't sacrifice for you so you would feel guilty about it. I sacrificed for you so you wouldn't have to. But if you'd known, you would have felt obligated to make it up to me somehow. You would have made decisions based on guilt instead of love. You would have visited me every week not because you wanted to spend time with me, but because you felt you owed me something. She looked at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. That's not the kind of relationship I wanted with you. So, instead, you let me think your love came without cost. Your love did come without cost, David, to you? The cost was mine to pay, and I paid it willingly. She returned to her painting, adding shadows to the base of the cathedral. But I'm 52 years old, and I'm tired of paying for something I'm not even sure I'm receiving anymore. The words hit him like a physical blow, even though he'd read them in her letter. Hearing them spoken aloud in her calm, measured voice made them seem more real and more devastating. I love you, Mom. I know I don't show it the way I should, but I do love you. I know you do. But love without respect, without consideration for the other person's feelings and needs, isn't really love. It's selfishness disguised as affection. David felt tears building behind his eyes. The same helpless frustration he'd experienced as a child when he disappointed her and didn't know how to make it right. Tell me how to fix this. Tell me what you need me to do. Maria set down her brush and turned to face him fully. I need you to stop seeing me as your mother. What? I need you to stop relating to me as the woman who raised you and start relating to me as the woman I am now. I need you to get to know Maria Hernandez, not just David's mom. I need you to ask me about my dreams and interests and opinions on things that have nothing to do with you or Tommy or your family. She gestured toward her painting, then toward the plaza around them. I need you to be curious about who I'm becoming instead of guilty about who I used to be. I need you to want to spend time with me because you enjoy my company, not because you feel obligated to honor the woman who sacrificed for you. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I, she admitted with a small smile. But I think we can figure it out together if we're both willing to try. David looked at his mother's painting, really looked at it for the first time. The watercolor was surprisingly sophisticated, with layers of color and light that suggested she'd been working on more than just this one piece. The composition was confident, the brushwork sure. How long have you been painting? I started the day after I arrived in Santa Fe. I walked into an art supply store and bought everything I needed, then came out here and started experimenting. She laughed, a sound lighter and freer than he remembered. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I love it. I love the way the colors blend, the way the light changes throughout the day, the way each painting turns out differently than I planned. It's beautiful. Thank you. She looked pleased in a way that had nothing to do with maternal pride or vicarious achievement. This was personal satisfaction, the joy of creating something entirely her own. What else have you been doing here? Everything? The word came out with an enthusiasm that transformed her face. I've been hiking in the mountains, visiting museums, taking a pottery class at the community center. I went to a flamenco performance last week and signed up for dance lessons. I've been reading books I never had time for and eating in restaurants where I don't have to worry about anyone else's dietary preferences. She paused, seeming to realize how her words might sound. I'm not saying this to hurt you, David. I'm saying it because I want you to understand that I'm discovering parts of myself I never knew existed. For 32 years, every decision I made was filtered through the question, is this good for David? Now I'm learning to ask, is this good for Maria? David watched a group of teenagers skateboarding near the fountain, their laughter echoing off the adobe buildings that surrounded the plaza. He tried to imagine his mother as a teenager before she'd become pregnant, before her entire identity had been subsumed into the role of single mother. What had she dreamed about then? What had she wanted to become? What was your major going to be? He asked suddenly. What? In college? Before you got pregnant with me, what were you planning to study? Maria's paintbrush stilled in her hand. I was going to study art education. I wanted to teach elementary school children how to paint and draw. She gestured toward her easel. I suppose it's never too late to learn what I wanted to teach. The revelation hit David like a punch to the stomach. His mother had given up her dreams of being an art teacher to raise him, and he'd never even known she was interested in art. In all their years together, through all their conversations about his school, his future, his dreams, he'd never once asked her what she'd wanted to do with her life. Mom, I'm so sorry. For what? Specifically? For never asking. For 32 years, I never asked what you wanted or what you'd given up or what you dreamed about. I just assumed you were happy being my mother, that it was enough for you. It was enough for a very long time. She began cleaning her brushes in a small jar of water, the paint swirling into abstract patterns. But people change. David, what satisfies us at 20 doesn't necessarily satisfy us at 50. I needed you to need me for so many years that I forgot I might want other things too. And now I'm learning what those other things are. She packed her paints into a wooden box that looked well used despite being recently purchased. I've been thinking about staying here longer than I originally planned. Maybe enrolling in some formal art classes, finding a part-time job, getting an apartment. David felt panic rise in his chest. You mean permanently? I mean for as long as it takes me to figure out who I am when I'm not organizing my life around. Yours. She stood and folded her easel with practiced efficiency. That might be 6 months, or it might be 6 years. I honestly don't know. But what about Tommy? What about family dinners? What about them? Her voice was gentle but firm. Tommy will grow up just fine without his grandmother. Organizing her life around his Sunday dinner schedule, and family dinners will mean more to both of us if they happen because we want to spend time together, not because it's expected. They walked back toward the hotel together, David carrying his mother's easel while she held her painting carefully to prevent the still wet paint from smudging. The late afternoon light painted everything in shades of gold and orange, and David found himself seeing Santa Fe through his mother's eyes, not as a tourist destination, but as a place where someone could build a new life. Sarah's been asking about you, he said as they reached the hotel entrance. She feels terrible about what happened at dinner. Sarah was protecting her family, Maria replied without apparent resentment. I can't fault her for that. But I hope she understands now that I was never trying to interfere with your marriage or undermine your authority as parents. I was just trying to find my place in a family structure that had changed without anyone telling me it had changed. In the hotel lobby, they sat in leather chairs near a fireplace that wouldn't be lit for another month. The conversation feeling both easier and more difficult than David had expected. Easier because his mother seemed more relaxed and open than she'd been in years. More difficult because he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd given up and what he'd thoughtlessly dismissed. I brought something for you, he said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. It's not much, but I wanted you to have it. Maria opened the envelope and found a check for $5,000. along with a handwritten note. She read the note silently, her expression unreadable. "This is too much money, David. It's not even a fraction of what you spent on me over the years. What you gave up to make sure I had what I needed." He leaned forward in his chair. "I calculated it out, Mom. Roughly the money you could have saved if you hadn't been supporting me, the salary you could have earned if you'd been able to go to college, the interest that money could have accumulated over 30 years. This doesn't even scratch the surface. I don't want your money. Then don't think of it as my money. Think of it as your money, finally coming back to you. Use it for art supplies or dance lessons, or whatever makes you happy. Use it to figure out who Maria Hernandez is supposed to be." She folded the check and put it back in the envelope, but she didn't return it to him. "Thank you. I want to come back," David said suddenly. "Not to check up on you or to convince you to come home. I want to come back to see what you're creating, to hear about your classes and your adventures. I want to get to know this version of you. I'd like that." Maria smiled, and for the first time since he'd arrived, it reached her eyes. "But I have one condition. Anything. Next time you come, don't find me through a private investigator. Call me first. Ask if you can visit. Give me the chance to say yes because I want to see you, not because you've tracked me down and I don't have a choice." David felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I was afraid you wouldn't want to see me. I'll always want to see you, David, but I want to see you as my friend, not as my obligation. There's a difference, and we both need to learn what that difference feels like." They stood and embraced for the first time since the disastrous dinner 3 weeks earlier, but this hug felt different from the dutiful embraces they'd shared for years. This felt like two people choosing to love each other instead of assuming they had to. "Tell Tommy his abuela is learning how to paint pictures of churches and mountains," Maria said as they walked toward the elevator. "Tell him I'm going to make him something beautiful to hang in his room. He misses you. I miss him too. But missing someone can be a good thing, David. It reminds you that love is a choice, not a habit." As the elevator doors closed between them, David waved goodbye to his mother and hello to Maria Hernandez, the woman he was just beginning to meet. For the first time in 32 years, he was looking forward to getting to know her. The drive back to Phoenix gave him 5 hours to think about everything that had changed and everything that needed to change still. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd made several decisions that would have seemed impossible a month earlier. He would call his mother once a week, but he would ask about her life, not just tell her about his. He would visit her in Santa Fe regularly, but only after asking permission first. He would stop expecting her to organize her life around his family's schedule and start organizing some of his life around getting to know the person she was becoming. Most importantly, he would stop taking for granted that love given freely was love without value. His mother had spent 32 years loving him more than she loved herself. The least he could do was love her enough to want her to be happy, even if that happiness looked different from what he'd expected. Sarah was waiting for him in the kitchen when he walked through the front door, her face anxious with questions. He wasn't sure he knew how to answer yet. "How is she?" she asked. "She's single quotes, double quotes, searching for the right words. She's becoming someone I've never met before, someone I think I'm going to really like getting to know." Tommy ran into the kitchen, still wearing his pajamas, his hair sticking up at impossible angles. "Daddy, did you see Abuela? Is she coming home?" David knelt down to his son's level, thinking about his mother's painting and her dance lessons and the light in her eyes when she talked about discovering parts of herself she'd never known existed. "She's not coming home yet, buddy, but she's learning how to paint pictures, and she's going to make something special just for you. And maybe this summer, we can go visit her and see all the beautiful things she's creating. Can I learn to paint, too?" "I think that's a great idea." David looked up at Sarah, seeing understanding and perhaps relief in her expression. "I think we could all learn some new things." That night, after Tommy was asleep and Sarah was reading in bed, David sat at his kitchen table and wrote his mother a letter. Not an email or a text message, but a real letter on paper, written by hand, the way she'd taught him when he was 7 years old. He told her about Tommy's reaction to hearing about her painting, about his plans to bring his family to visit her in Santa Fe, about the changes he wanted to make in how they related to each other. He told her he was proud of her for choosing herself finally. After 32 years of choosing him, most importantly, he told her he was sorry for calling her a burden when she was actually the strongest, most selfless person he'd ever known. And he promised that when they built their new relationship, the one between David and Maria instead of son and mother, he would never take her love for granted again. He mailed the letter the next morning, along with a package containing a set of professional watercolor paints and a book about the art history of the American Southwest. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the beginning of something larger. The beginning of loving his mother the way she deserved to be loved. As as a person with her own dreams and desires, instead of just as the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him. 3 weeks later, he received a painting in the Mela watercolor of the cathedral in Santa Fe, with 2 figures sitting on a bench in the foreground, deep in conversation. On the back, in his mother's careful handwriting, she'd written, "The beginning of a beautiful friendship. Love, Maria." David hung the painting in his living room where every guest who visited could see it and ask about the story behind it. And each time someone asked, he would tell them about his mother, not the woman who had raised him, but the woman who had chosen to raise herself, and who had taught him that the most profound act of love is sometimes learning to let go. 6 months later, David stood in Maria's new apartment in Santa Fe's Railyard district, helping her hang a collection of paintings she'd completed in her first formal art class. The space was small but bright, with large windows that caught the morning light, and adobe walls painted in warm earth tones that reflected her newly discovered aesthetic preferences. "This one should go above the couch," Tommy announced with the authority of a 6-year-old interior designer, pointing to a vibrant landscape of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He'd grown 2 inches since his grandmother had left Phoenix, and his vocabulary now included words like composition and color theory from their regular phone. "Conversations about art?" "I think Tommy's right," Sarah said, stepping back to survey the wall arrangement. Over the past 6 months, she'd developed her own relationship with Mariant as David's mother, but as an interesting woman who'd chosen to completely rebuild her life at 52. Their conversations now covered topics ranging from local Santa Fe politics to the challenges of learning new skills in middle age, subjects that had nothing to do with David or Tommy or family obligations. Maria, tanned and confident in ways that continued to surprise her son, climbed down from the stepladder she'd been using to hang pictures. "Tommy has excellent artistic instincts. Maybe he inherited them from his abuela." "Maybe he did," David agreed, though he knew that any artistic talent his son possessed came from genetic material David had never known existed in his family. His mother's creativity had been so thoroughly subsumed into the practical demands of single parenthood that none of them had realized it was there. They finished hanging the paintings and ordered pizza from a local restaurant Maria had discovered in her explorations of her new neighborhood. As they ate, she told them about her latest project, a series of paintings documenting the daily life of Santa Fe's Plaza throughout the seasons, and her plans to apply for a part-time job at one of the local galleries. "Are you happy here?" David asked as they cleaned up the dinner dishes, a question he'd learned to ask regularly without any hidden agenda about wanting her to come home. "Happier than I've been in decades," she answered without hesitation. "I miss you all, of course, but missing you feels different now. It feels like love instead of loss." That evening, after Tommy had fallen asleep on Maria's new couch and Sarah was reading in the guest room, David and his mother sat on her small balcony watching the stars emerge over the high desert landscape. The conversation flowed easily between them now, covering everything from local politics to art history to David's latest work projects. It was the kind of conversation he might have with any friend, thoughtful, reciprocal, based on mutual interest rather than familial obligation. "I have something to tell you," Maria said as the evening grew cool enough to require sweaters. "I've been seeing someone." David felt a moment of surprise, then genuine pleasure. "Tell me about him." "His name is Robert. He's a retired English teacher who moved here from Colorado last year. We met in my pottery class, and he's been teaching me about the writers and poets who've lived in New Mexico over the years. He's kind and funny and completely unimpressed by the fact that I spent 30 years doing nothing but raising a child." "That sounds wonderful, Mom." "Maria," she corrected gently, a reminder that had become routine between them. "Maria," David repeated, smiling. "I'm happy for you. I want you to meet him next time you visit, not because I need your approval, but because I'd like the people I care about to know each other." "I'd like that too." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into night. David thought about the dinner 6 months earlier. That had started with his mother being dismissed as a burden and ended with her walking out of their lives. He thought about the letter that had taught him the difference between sacrifice and love, between obligation and choice. Most of all, he thought about the woman sitting beside him, now confident, creative, building relationships and pursuing interests that had nothing to do with being anyone's mother. He was proud of her in ways he'd never thought to be proud before, and grateful for her in ways that went beyond appreciation for her sacrifices. "Thank you," he said suddenly. "For what?" "For leaving, for writing that letter, for teaching me that love isn't something you owe someone or something they owe you, for showing me what it looks like when someone chooses to love themselves." Maria reached over and squeezed his hand, her fingers warm despite the cool evening air. Thank you for letting me go, and for wanting to get to know who I am now instead of who I used to be." The next morning, as David's family prepared to drive back to Phoenix, Tommy hugged his grandmother goodbye with the easy affection of a child who understood that love didn't require constant presence to remain strong. "Will you paint me a picture of the mountains?" he asked. "I'll paint you a whole series," Maria promised. "And maybe next time you visit, you can help me with one." "Can I really?" "Of course. We're going to be artistic partners." As they drove away, David watched his mother in the rearview mirror, standing in front of her apartment building, waving goodbye. She looked smaller from a distance, but somehow more substantial, more present, more authentically herself than she'd ever appeared in the 32 years when her entire identity had been wrapped up in being his mother. "I like Abuela's new house," Tommy announced from his car seat as they merged onto the highway toward home. "I do too," Sarah agreed. "She seems really happy there." "She does," David said, and meant it completely. He'd spent most of his adult life taking his mother's love for granted, assuming it was infinite and unconditional and always available whenever he needed it. Now he understood that the most precious kind of love was the kind someone chose to give freely, without obligation or expectation of return. His mother had spent 32 years loving him more than she loved herself. Now she was learning to love herself, and paradoxically, that made her love for him more valuable, not less. Because now when she told him she loved him, when she made time to see him, when she painted pictures for his son and asked about his life, he knew she was doing it because she wanted to, not because she felt she had to. It was the difference between duty and devotion, between sacrifice and gift. It was the difference between being someone's burden and being someone's choice. And for the first time in his life, David understood that being chosen was infinitely more precious than being owed.